In the summer of 1944, as war tore through Italy's hills, a small Tuscan villa became the stage for an act of calculated vengeance. 3 lives, taken in cold precision, not for what they had done, but for who they were. It was August 1944, and the Tuscan hills shimmered under a merciless sun. The air carried the heavy perfume of ripened peaches, mingling with the dust that clung to every leaf and blade of grass. To a passerby, Illinois Focardo, the stately villa tucked among cypress and olive groves southeast of Florence, might have looked like a postcard from a calmer time. But in the shadows, the war had drawn its own borders, invisible lines of danger and betrayal. Robert Einstein, an engineer by trade and farmer by choice, watched this world from concealment. For 2 weeks he had lived as a shadow among the trees, just beyond sight of his home. He had taken nothing but a blanket and a single book snatched from his library before slipping into hiding. Nights were spent on the hard earth beneath oak and hazelnut branches, or in the spare shelter of a sympathetic farmer's barn. Each day was measured in whispers and caution, ears straining for the crack of gunfire or the metallic growl of approaching engines. The decision to hide had come quickly, but not without anguish. A fortnight earlier, German soldiers from the feared Hermann Göring division had arrived at his front gate, asking for him by name. By sheer luck, he had been working in the fields, and the intruders were turned away. That night, Robert sat with his wife, Nina, and their 2 daughters, Luce and Cece, weighing their choices. They decided he would vanish into the countryside, while the women stayed behind in the villa. The reasoning seemed sound. The Nazis wanted Robert, not his Christian wife and daughters. Staying apart, they thought, would protect them all. But as the days dragged on, worry gnawed at him. Each rustle in the undergrowth was a possible messenger of doom. Each distant boom of artillery seemed a reminder that their fragile separation could shatter in an instant. He clung to the hope that the Allies, rumored to be advancing steadily from the south, would arrive before the Germans returned. On the morning of August 3rd, Robert waited at the edge of the wood for the sound of his wife's footsteps. They had agreed on this clandestine meeting. Nina would bring news, but only if she felt it was safe. When he finally heard her voice, relief softened the tightness in his chest. She emerged from the path, flushed from the heat, a small parcel in hand. Her words carried a fragile optimism. The peach harvest had begun, the girls were well, and Allied forces were reportedly close, perhaps just days from Florence. They spoke quietly, as though any raised voice might summon danger. Robert studied her face, unchanged in his eyes despite the years. He felt the old pull to walk her home, to sit together in the Villa Sala Rosa as they had before. But before he could dwell on it, a sudden, violent crash echoed from the direction of the house. Nina's eyes widened. Without another word, she turned and ran. The wrought iron gates of Il Focardo loomed ahead as she sprinted down the cypress-lined drive. Her breath came in sharp bursts, sweat streaking her temples. The heavy front doors had been shattered inward. Stepping over splintered wood, she found herself face to face with 7 German soldiers, weapons slung and eyes cold. Their leader, a thin man with round glasses, demanded her name, then asked again and again where her husband was. Nina's silence held. The agreement with Robert had been clear. She would not betray his hiding place, no matter the cost. Moments later, the hallway filled with the rest of the household. Luce and Cece, Nina's sister Saba, their nieces Anna Maria, Lorenza, and Paula. Even the family's sheepdog, Ali, padded among the boots and uniforms, oblivious to the tension. The Germans' questions grew sharper. Where was Robert Einstein? Where was Albert Einstein's cousin? Outside, the war was closing in. Inside, the trap was beginning to spring. The questions came like hammer blows, each one meant to crack her resolve. The German captain's voice, precise and clipped, seemed to echo in the high-ceilinged hallway. He wanted Robert, the man he described with a peculiar mix of contempt and interest, not simply as a farmer or local landowner, but as Albert Einstein's cousin. Nina's reply was the same each time. Silence. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was the only defense she had left. The soldiers' eyes shifted to the others in the room, measuring their value, their fear. Luce stood tall beside her mother. At 27, in her final year of medical school, she had learned how to mask panic behind steady eyes. Cece, younger and more restless by nature, clenched her hands, forcing herself to stay still. Their nieces clustered close, confused but sensing danger. The Germans ordered them all toward the cellar. They claimed it was for safety. Allied bombers had been hitting nearby towns. But there was something too deliberate, too controlled, in the way the soldiers herded them down the narrow corridor. The door shut with a hollow finality. Metal clanged, a key turned. In the darkness, the familiar scent of the villa's cool stone walls mixed with the earthy smell of stored wine and olives. As their eyes adjusted, the women realized they weren't alone. Families from the estate, the contadini, were already down here. Faces Nina knew well. Orlando Fusciati, the Fattore who managed Il Focardo with quiet precision. His wife, Irenia, with her calm, tired eyes. Pipwan, the deputy manager, tall and mustachioed, who had become Robert's close friend. These were not strangers to the Einsteins. They were part of the life Robert had built here, a life that seemed impossibly distant now, though only days had passed since it had still been whole. Robert Einstein had not always been a farmer in the Tuscan hills. His roots traced back to Munich, 1884, where he was born into a household already tied by blood and business to one of the most famous names of the 20th century. His father, Jacob, and Jacob's brother Hermann ran an electrical engineering company, J. Einstein and Company. Their venture lit streets, cafes, and even the Munich Oktoberfest. In that same household lived Hermann's son, Albert, 4 years older than Robert. The two boys grew up more like brothers than cousins, sharing music lessons, games beneath the old trees outside their home, and evenings when Albert would explain strange ideas about light and space that Robert couldn't yet fully grasp. But prosperity in the Einstein family never lasted. The business collapsed and the clan scattered, from Munich to Milan, then to Genoa. Robert learned early that stability was a fragile thing, easily lost to bad contracts or shifting economies. By his 20s, Robert was in Rome studying engineering. That was where he met Nina Mazzetti, a woman with her own history of loss and resilience. They married in 1913, dreaming of a quiet life. But within a year, Europe was at war. Robert, like many assimilated German Jews, enlisted, serving in the Bavarian Light Infantry. He endured the mud and slaughter of the Western Front, carrying home both scars and the conviction that life, when peace returned, should be rooted in something tangible. When the war ended, the couple returned to Italy. Over the years, Robert's engineering skills paid for something they both longed for: land. Land to work with their hands, to shelter their children, to shape into a place where beauty and labor could live side by side. That dream reached its height with Il Focardo. The villa, the orchards, the rows of vines glowing in the sun. Here, Robert was not just Albert Einstein's cousin. He was Padrone, a man respected by his workers for his fairness, his care, and the simple fact that he loved the soil as much as they did. Now, in the summer of 1944, those same fields lay just beyond the trees where Robert hid. And in the cool dark of the cellar, his wife and daughters waited, locked in with neighbors who could not understand why German soldiers, with the Allies so close, had risked a raid on this particular house. The answer, though unspoken, was taking shape in Nina's mind. This was no random search. It was a vendetta, personal, deliberate, and deadly. The cellar's air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp stone and the quiet dread that clung to everyone trapped inside. Somewhere above, boots moved across wooden floors, slow, deliberate, like predators circling prey. Nina tried to focus on the steady rhythm of her breathing. The women around her whispered in fragments. About the soldiers' clean uniforms, about the captain with the thin face and round glasses, about the way they'd mentioned Robert's name. Not just his name, his bloodline. Albert Einstein's cousin. The words had hung in the air like a sentence already passed. She glanced at Orlando, the estate manager. He caught her eye, his own expression taut but calm, the way a man looks when he's already assessed every possible outcome and is simply waiting for the first move. Pip 1, standing further back, kept glancing toward the door. His jaw was set, but his hands twitched, as if they couldn't decide whether to form fists or reach for a tool that might serve as a weapon. Children huddled against their mothers. The youngest whimpered until Julia, Pipone's wife, began humming a lullaby so soft it was nearly swallowed by the cellar's walls. Even in the stifling dark, the sound carried a fragile thread of normality, like a memory of safer times. Above them, the villa was more than a home. For Robert, it had been proof that his life's hard turns, 2 bankruptcies in his family's past, a war that had nearly broken him, had not been for nothing. He had worked the land with the contadini, walked the peach orchards in the height of summer, tasted the year's first oil pressed from the estate's olives. The purchase of Il Focardo in 1937 had felt like the final act of reclaiming stability. Its 250 acres rolled out in orderly rhythms. Wheat in July, grapes in September, olives in November. The Massacre system bound him to the families who worked here, not as a distant landlord but as a partner. He opened the chapel for their use, shared the bounty of the harvest, and in return earned something more valuable than profit: loyalty. That loyalty was what Nina clung to now, pressed against the cold wall of the cellar. Surely no one from Il Focardo would betray them. Surely the neighbors, the priest, even the casual visitors from nearby Trogi would have no reason to guide the Germans here. And yet, the Germans were here. 7 soldiers with clean uniforms, days before the Allies were expected to enter Florence. They hadn't come to arrest a group of unknown partisans or to seize the estate for strategic value. They'd come for Robert. Outside the villa, the war's advance was unmistakable. In recent weeks, Allied bombers had shaken the valleys, targeting bridges and rail lines. Rumors traveled faster than the troops. British and American forces were pushing north, and the German retreat was growing desperate. Robert had clung to that hope when he went into hiding. He'd imagined slipping back into the villa just as the first Allied patrols arrived. But hope was a fragile thing in wartime. It could vanish in the space between a closed door and the turning of a key. In the cellar, someone asked how long they'd be kept down there. No one answered. Nina's mind was already working on a more urgent question. If this was about Robert and Robert wasn't here, what would the Germans do to the ones who were? The cellar door stayed shut, but the sounds from above grew sharper, more purposeful. Drawers scraped open. Heavy furniture shifted. Footsteps paced in irregular bursts, as if the soldiers were both searching and waiting. Then came the thud of boots down the corridor above the cellar steps. The metal latch squealed. A wedge of light cut through the gloom, blinding in its suddenness. The captain with the round glasses stood framed in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the stone floor. He scanned the group without speaking, his gaze resting on Nina for just a second too long before moving on. In that silence, the air seemed to shrink, pressing tighter around them all. Finally, he spoke, measured, almost conversational, telling them they would remain here until their safety could be assured. The choice of words was a lie, and everyone in the cellar knew it. The door shut again. The lock clicked. The darkness returned. To understand why the Germans might come for Robert Einstein in August 1944, you had to understand how quickly the tides in Italy had turned. Only a year earlier, Mussolini still ruled, and German soldiers were allies under the fascist banner. But 1943 had split the country in two. In July of that year, Allied forces had landed in Sicily. Within weeks, Mussolini had been overthrown and arrested. By September, Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies. The king and the government fled south. The Germans, swift and ruthless, occupied the north and central regions. What had been uneasy cooperation turned overnight into a military occupation. And for Jews in Italy, the danger transformed from bureaucratic prejudice to outright persecution. Robert's status was complicated. He was married to a Christian woman. His daughters were, by religious definition, not Jewish. But Robert himself was Jewish by birth. And in the eyes of the Nazis, he was also kin to a man they viewed as both enemy and symbol. Albert Einstein, the intellectual they despised, the exile who had spoken against them from across the Atlantic. This was why the Germans' presence at Il Focardo didn't fit the pattern of a random sweep. They weren't here to round up unknown families in the chaos of retreat. They were here for something or someone specific. In the cellar, the minutes stretched into an hour. Conversations dwindled to whispers, then to silence. The youngest children slept in their mothers' laps. The older girls sat rigid, ears tuned to every creak above. Nina's mind flicked between two thoughts she couldn't reconcile. That Robert was out there somewhere, safe for the moment, and that she might never see him again. She had no way of knowing that in the woods nearby, Robert was hearing none of this, that he was still holding to the belief that splitting the family had been the safest choice. Above, the noises shifted. Less searching now, more movement toward the front of the house. Boots crossed the foyer. Voices barked in German. And then, silence again. The kind of silence that isn't relief, but the breath held before something breaks. 6 years before the cellar, before the sound of German boots on Tuscan floors, Illinois Focardo was alive with another kind of noise. The hum of harvest, the chatter of workers, the laughter of 4 young girls racing each other down the cypress-lined drive. Robert and Nina had built their life here on a kind of unspoken bargain. That hard work, fairness, and loyalty could keep the world's chaos at bay. The orchards gave peaches in late summer, the vines blushed with grapes in September, and the olive groves promised their peppery oil by November. The land gave back what they poured into it. Religion in the Einstein household was as varied as the people in it. Nina raised her daughters in the Protestant Waldensian faith she'd been born into. Robert respected that, just as he respected the Catholic upbringing of their nieces, Lorenza and Paula, after they had come to live at Il Focardo. He was open about his Jewish heritage but kept his atheism firm and quiet. In the late 1930s, that balance seemed secure enough. Mussolini's fascist government was firm in its grip, but Robert, like many business-minded Italians, had appreciated its early focus on stability and development. Jewish Italians could still be found in parliament, in banking, in the military. Mussolini himself had Jewish colleagues and supporters. But politics has a way of shifting in the shadows before the change shows on the surface. In May 1938, Adolf Hitler came to Florence. Mussolini, eager to impress, poured money into cleaning the city's streets, scrubbing away any hint of neglect. The Führer was given the kind of reception reserved for emperors, motorcades through cheering crowds, a guided view from Piazzale Michelangelo, and a tour of Santa Croce. Robert's city apartment was just steps from that basilica. Whether he and Nina watched the procession themselves or heard it from their windows, there was no missing the message. Italy's friendship with Nazi Germany was no longer a political convenience. It was a public embrace. 6 months later, the racial laws were announced. They came like an unexpected frost, stripping citizenship from Jews, barring them from schools, universities, public office, and land holdings over 125 acres. Intermarriage with non-Jews was forbidden. Professions, once stable, could be stripped away overnight. Robert lost his citizenship. Luce and Cece, though Christian, were classified by bloodline and stripped of theirs as well. Nina, born and baptized in Italy, kept hers. The laws weren't enforced with the same brutality as in Germany. Not yet. And so daily life continued, but now with a shadow overhead. Some took the hint and left. Robert's cousin Maya, sensing the change in the air, booked passage to the United States in early 1939. Her husband returned to Switzerland. Robert stayed. The land was his anchor, and leaving it felt like surrendering the very stability he'd spent his life building. Still, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. In May 1938, Mussolini had stood in the Piazza della Repubblica, a square built on the ruins of Florence's old Jewish ghetto, and celebrated Hitler's visit. To those who knew the city's history, it was a reminder that persecution could be resurrected from memory as easily as a monument. And in the years to come, Robert would learn that history never really sleeps. The radio in the Sala Rosa was the family's link to the wider world. A polished wood cabinet that could fill the high-ceilinged room with Beethoven one night and with the blunt voice of propaganda the next. On the evening of June 10, 1940, the voice belonged to Benito Mussolini. From his balcony in Rome, he roared to a crowd so vast it seemed to answer in one breath. Italy was at war. Robert sat listening with Nina and the girls. The words were meant to inspire. Talk of courage, victory, a long period of peace and justice that would follow. But Robert knew war's promises. He had heard them in 1914, and he had seen what they delivered. Still, for a time, life at Il Focardo went on. The land obeyed its own calendar, indifferent to politics. The wheat ripened in July, the grapes swelled in September, and the olive trees leaned into the autumn winds. Shortages crept in, fertilizer, tools, even hands to work the fields as young men left for the front. But they adapted. For Jews in Italy, the early war years brought an uneasy reprieve. Mussolini's racial laws still hung over them, but their enforcement was inconsistent. Refugees from France, Belgium, and beyond arrived in Florence, believing Italy to be safer than the Nazi-occupied territories they had fled. For a while it was. Then came 1943, and with it, the chain of events that would unravel everything. On July 10th, Allied troops landed in Sicily. Within weeks, Mussolini was deposed by his own Grand Fascist Council and arrested. Italians poured into the streets in cautious celebration. The war might end, they thought. The illusion lasted less than 2 months. September 8th brought the announcement. Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies. In Florence and the surrounding villages, church bells rang wildly, their joy spilling out into the countryside. But the sound was premature. The German army was already moving. In 3 days, they occupied Florence. In the north and center of the country, the war turned upside down. Former allies became occupiers. For Italian Jews, the threat shifted from political discrimination to active, organized persecution. Deportations began almost immediately. The wave reached closer to home in late August, when Nina's sister Ada, living in Pisa, endured a heavy Allied bombing raid that killed nearly 1,000 civilians. Her daughter, Anna Maria, was sent to Il Focardo for safety. Safety. The word had begun to feel brittle. The Germans were not just an army in retreat. They were an army striking back at anything or anyone they saw as an enemy. For Robert, his heritage and his famous cousin made him both visible and vulnerable. In the autumn of 1943, he began to wonder how long the villa's quiet hills could shield them. By the next summer, he would have his answer. By the summer of 1944, Florence was a city holding its breath. Allied forces were pressing from the south, their bombers already hammering bridges and rail lines to cut German escape routes. Every week brought fresh rumors. British troops in Chiusi, Americans moving through Arezzo, but the Germans still held the city, their withdrawal calculated and slow. Il Focardo lay just beyond the city's southeast edge, its orchards and olive groves baking under a relentless Tuscan sun. Robert felt the war's advance in every sound. The low thunder of artillery from the valleys, the deeper, more ominous rumble of B-24 bombers overhead, the dry rattle of machine gun bursts echoing from distant hills. It was then, in late July, that the first knock came. Not the polite rap of a neighbor, but a pounding fist that rattled the front doors. Members of the Hermann Göring Division, soldiers known for their brutality, demanded to see Robert Einstein. He happened to be out in the fields. The women who answered the door told the truth in the only way that mattered. He wasn't there. That night, Robert and Nina sat at the heavy dining table with their daughters. The question was unavoidable: what to do if the Germans came back. Robert was the target. That much was clear. The girls were Christians, Nina a lifelong Protestant. Would that shield them? They told themselves it might. The decision, when it came, felt like a compromise between logic and fear. Robert would hide nearby, close enough to hear news, far enough to avoid capture. The women would stay in the villa, their presence a kind of shield for the property. For 2 weeks, Robert lived in the woods, wrapped in the uneven comfort of secrecy. He carried only a blanket and a book, sleeping under trees or in a farmer's shed, never in the same place twice. Sometimes a passing partisan or a black marketeer would bring him rumors of the war's progress. More precious still were the visits from Nina. Quick, careful exchanges of news in a shaded spot out of sight of the villa. On the morning of August 3rd, Their meeting began like the others. A quiet greeting, a few words about the girls, about the peach harvest, about Allied troops said to be just 20 miles south of Florence. It might all be over within days, she told him. Maybe even tomorrow. And then came the sound, a heavy crash from the direction of the villa, the kind of noise that leaves no doubt something has been broken. Nina's face changed in an instant. She turned and ran. By the time she reached the Cypress Line Drive, the villa's great doors were splintered. Inside, 7 German soldiers stood in the hall. Their captain's thin face and round glasses gave him a bookish air that did nothing to soften the authority in his voice. He wanted Robert. He asked again and again. Nina said nothing. Moments later, the household was marched toward the cellar. The air there was cool and damp, but the fear was sharp enough to taste. Above, the boots kept moving, searching, waiting. The cellar had its own kind of darkness. Not just the absence of light, but the heavy, unmoving air of a place meant for storing wine and oil, not people. The walls sweated with damp. The stone floor leached its chill into their feet. The only movement came from the children. A fidget here, a shift there, the quiet rustle of fabric as a girl leaned against her mother's shoulder. Julia's soft humming had faded. Even whispers seemed dangerous now, as if the soldiers above might hear the shape of words through the floorboards. Nina's thoughts kept circling the same unanswerable question. Who had told them? The road to Il Focardo wasn't a place one stumbled onto. The estate sat at the end of a long lane, ringed with orchards, hidden from casual view. If the Germans had come here, they had come with a reason and with directions. She glanced at Orlando Fusciati, the estate manager, whose expression was carefully neutral. Pipwan, standing beside him, shifted his weight and let his eyes roam toward the ceiling, as if trying to read the movement above. Both men had worked for Robert for years, their loyalty proven in ways big and small. She wanted to believe none of the contadini had betrayed them, but the thought still pricked at her, unwelcome and persistent. Above, the boots paused. Furniture scraped against the floor, heavy pieces being moved. A single voice barked an order in German, answered by another. Then came the sound of something metallic striking wood. Searching, always searching. The reality of August 1944 was this. The Germans were losing Florence, but they were not leaving quietly. Every retreating step was laced with destruction. Bridges blown, rail lines severed, buildings mined. And somewhere in their orders, or perhaps only in their captain's mind, Robert Einstein had become a target worth finding. To the Nazis, Robert was not just another Jewish man. He was family to a man they called a traitor and an enemy, Albert Einstein, the voice of scientific genius that had turned openly against them. Robert was the reachable echo of a man beyond their grasp. In the cellar, time stretched until it no longer felt like hours or minutes, only waiting. The women and children sat in a kind of suspended animation, braced for the moment the door would open. When it did, it wasn't with the crash of force, but with the slow creak of deliberate choice. The captain appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the light behind him. He looked at them as one might study a set of tools, deciding which to take and which to leave behind. Then, without a word, he closed the door again. The lock clicked. The stillness returned, heavier now because everyone in the room understood. Whatever was coming next, it would not be random. The air in the cellar had shifted. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The soldiers upstairs were no longer searching. They had found whatever they meant to find, or decided they didn't need to. Then the sound came, boots on the stairs. Not hurried, not hesitant, but steady, each step deliberate. The door swung open and light spilled across the uneven stone floor. The captain's glasses caught the glare, masking his eyes. He spoke in German, his tone flat, as if giving routine instructions. Nina understood every word. A few of the women were to come upstairs. No explanation, no reason, just names spoken with that clipped precision. Hers, Luce, Cici. The others were to stay behind. For a moment, the cellar seemed to shrink, the air thick enough to choke. Julia's hand gripped Nina's arm for the briefest instant, a touch equal parts comfort and warning. The children clung to their mothers, and one of the twins began to cry. Not a wail, just the small, frightened sound of someone too young to understand but old enough to feel the danger. Nina straightened her back. She told Luce and Cece to follow her. She didn't look at the others as they passed. She couldn't bear the mix of pity and fear she'd see in their eyes. Up the narrow steps, the air grew warmer, the light harsher. The hallway was stripped of its usual life. No scent of bread from the kitchen. No polished gleam from the Sala Rosa's wood floors. Only the soldiers, their weapons slung but ready, eyes fixed on their captain for the next order. In the woods beyond the villa, Robert didn't know that his wife and daughters were walking straight into the center of the storm he had tried to avoid. He'd heard nothing, no shouts, no gunfire, no reason yet to abandon the plan. The irony, if he'd known it, would have been bitter. In trying to protect them by staying away, he had left them alone in the one moment his presence might have mattered. The captain led the three women into the main hall. His men fanned out, closing invisible doors around them with their mere presence. Nina didn't ask why they'd been brought up. She already understood enough to know the question wouldn't matter. Somewhere in the quiet that followed, the captain said something that chilled her more than the cellar's damp walls ever could. It was not about Robert now. It was about them, what they represented, who they were related to, and the message their deaths could send. The captain's words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. Spoken in the calm, deliberate register of a man executing a decision already made, they carried more weight than a barked command ever could. Nina caught fragments that made her chest tighten. Reprisal. Enemy bloodline. A lesson. It wasn't Robert they were speaking of now, but the family in front of them, her daughters. Killing them would be a message, one meant to reach farther than Focardo's gates. Luce's posture was rigid beside her mother, but Nina could feel her daughter's pulse in the hand she squeezed, rapid and unsteady. Cece tried to stand tall, but her eyes darted to each soldier, searching for a trace of hesitation. There was none. The captain moved slightly, and his men responded without needing an order. They closed the space around the three women, not touching them yet, but close enough that escape was no longer even an abstract thought. In the cellar, the others strained to hear what was happening above. Orlando kept his face blank, but his eyes were fixed upward. Pip One stood like a man on the edge of stepping forward, held back only by the knowledge that any move could doom everyone in the room. The youngest children had stopped fidgeting, their instincts telling them that the silence was worse than noise. Somewhere in the dark, a woman began murmuring a prayer under her breath. Nina's mind was both focused and scattered, every sense heightened. She saw the small details, the scuffed leather on one soldier's boots, the faint scent of oil and metal from another's rifle, the way the light from the high windows turned the dust in the air into drifting motes, as if the villa itself were holding its breath. She thought of Robert in the woods, the last look on his face when they'd parted. She thought of how quickly a life could turn from orchards and harvests to this narrow corridor between life and death. The captain gave a single, almost casual nod. The decision was sealed. The nod was so slight it could have been missed by anyone not watching for it. But the soldiers saw it, and that was all that mattered. They moved as one, hands tightening on rifles, eyes hardening into something impersonal. Nina's breath caught in her throat. She pulled Luce and Cece closer, her arms tightening around them as if sheer will might be enough to hold back what was coming. She didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that would change the course of this moment. The captain stepped back, allowing his men to close in. Command in German, short and sharp, cut through the air. The first shot cracked in the high-ceilinged hall, the sound bouncing off stone and wood with cruel clarity. The second and third followed almost instantly, merging into a single echo that rolled through the villa. In the cellar below, everyone flinched. The sound needed no translation. A child began to cry, muffled quickly by her mother's hand. Orlando stared at the floor, jaw clenched, his silence the only way to keep from breaking. Above, the silence after the gunfire was almost worse than the shots themselves. Dust drifted in the air where the echoes had been. The soldiers moved without ceremony, their task complete. The captain gave a brief glance toward the bodies, not long enough to acknowledge them as people, only long enough to confirm the message had been delivered. It wasn't about Robert's capture now. It was about erasing his world, striking where he was most human, most vulnerable. A vendetta, not against a soldier or a spy, but against a man whose only crime was his name and his bloodline. In the woods beyond the estate, Robert heard nothing. The wind in the cypress, the occasional distant thump of artillery, the calls of unseen birds. These were the sounds that kept him company. He was still waiting for the sign that it was safe to come home. When that sign finally came, it would be too late. The first hint came not as a sound, but as an absence. The usual faint traces of life from the villa, the bark of Ollie, the metallic clang of a bucket, the hum of a voice carrying on the air were gone. The estate felt hollow. Robert had been in the woods most of the day, his mind gnawed by the same doubts that had plagued him since the plan began. When the silence became too complete, he started toward the edge of the trees. It was late afternoon. The light stretched thin and gold across the valley. Halfway to the villa, he saw movement on the road. A boy from the village, bare-legged, dusty, eyes wide. He stopped when he saw Robert, hesitating like someone carrying a weight too heavy for his small frame. Then the boy spoke, blurting the words as if saying them quickly would make them less real. Robert didn't remember dropping the bundle he'd been carrying. He remembered running. The cypress line drive was longer than he'd ever known it to be. The villa's front doors hung shattered, just as Nina had seen them earlier that day. Inside, the air was stale and still, the way a house feels after something has left it that cannot return. He found them in the hall, Nina, Luce, and Cece, where the soldiers had left them. The sunlight slanted through the high windows, falling across the still forms, making the scene almost too quiet to belong to the world he knew. There was no question of what had happened. The precision of the violence, the cold efficiency of its aftermath, spoke of men who saw this not as murder, but as the completion of a task. Robert knelt beside them. His hands, so used to building and repairing, now trembled over faces he could not fix. The house, the orchards, the vines. All of it seemed to collapse inward, meaningless in the shadow of what the Germans had done. He didn't cry then. Not yet. The shock was too deep, the need to understand too urgent. Somewhere beneath the numbness, another thought was forming. One that would take root and grow in the years to come. This had been no act of random cruelty. This was deliberate. This was a vendetta. The hours after Robert found them blurred into a series of images he would carry for the rest of his life. Not as a sequence, but as fragments, each one sharp enough to cut. The first were the faces of the contadini as they emerged from the cellar, their steps hesitant, their eyes unable to meet his. They had heard the gunfire. They had feared the worst. And now, seeing him standing there in the hall, they understood the truth without a word being spoken. Some knelt to pray. Others crossed themselves, their hands trembling. Orlando approached Robert, his voice low and thick, offering what comfort he could in the language of shared labor and loyalty. Pip One stood back, his fists clenched, his jaw working as if chewing on words that would never come. The war didn't pause for grief. In the hills beyond the estate, the crack and thud of battle rolled closer. Allied troops were pressing northward. The Germans were burning bridges, mining roads, leaving destruction in their wake. Even here, with 3 bodies in the villa's main hall, the reality was that the front line was only miles away. Robert knew the soldiers could return. Not these ones, perhaps, but others. The villa was no fortress. Couldn't protect the dead, and it could barely protect the living. Some of the villagers urged him to leave at once, to save himself before the retreating Germans decided to finish the job. But Robert's feet felt anchored to the stone floor. Leaving them here felt impossible. That night, the estate was wrapped in a darkness heavier than any blackout. No lamps, no fires, just the thin silver light of a moon slipping between clouds. Robert moved through the villa in near silence, his hand brushing the walls as if to reassure himself the house was still there, even if the life inside it had been ripped away. In one room, the table still held the remnants of a meal, plates half cleared. In another, a vase of wildflowers, already wilting. Ordinary things, now relics of a world that had ended in the space of 3 rifle shots. By morning, News of the killings had spread to nearby villages. Some came quietly to pay respects. Others stayed away, afraid to be seen too close to the Einstein name now. The war had taught them caution. Who you were seen with could decide your fate. Robert didn't judge them for it. He understood fear. But he also understood something else. Whoever had ordered this had done it not just to kill his family, but to send a warning. And if they thought he would disappear quietly into the chaos of war, they didn't know him at all. The sound came first. A deep, rolling percussion of artillery, closer now, mingled with the sharper bursts of small arms fire. From the ridge above Il Focardo, smoke rose in uneven columns. The war was shifting. On August 11, 1944, Florence shook with a different kind of noise. Allied troops entered the city, their tanks and jeeps rumbling over streets still littered with debris from German demolitions. Crowds gathered in cautious celebration, waving flags pulled from hiding, offering flowers and wine to soldiers who were already scanning rooftops for snipers. Robert heard the bells, their peals rolling out over the valley, but they felt distant, almost unreal. Liberation had come, yes. The Germans had retreated, but they had already left their mark in his home, in the stillness of the villa's great hall. In the first days after the Allies arrived, the countryside filled with rumors and half-truths. Some said the killings at Il Focardo had been a random act by desperate soldiers. Others whispered of orders from higher up, something deliberate, aimed at the Einstein name itself. Robert didn't need to weigh the theories. He had lived long enough in both Germany and Italy to know the language of intimidation when he saw it. This was not chaos. This was chosen. The Allied officers who came to the villa were polite but brisk. There was a war to finish, a city to stabilize. They asked questions about the day of the killings, about descriptions of the men, about Robert's whereabouts when it happened. He answered carefully, knowing each word was being noted, but feeling an impatience rising in him. Not at the questions, but at the idea that this could be treated like just another entry in the ledger of wartime crimes. The officers left, promising to forward the information to the proper authorities. Robert stood on the steps, watching their jeep disappear down the drive, the dust hanging in the air long after they were gone. Florence celebrated in the streets for weeks. Cafes reopened, churches rang their bells without fear of German reprisal, and families reunited after years apart. But at Il Focardo, the rooms stayed quiet. The liberation had changed the flags flying over the city, but it had not altered the fact that 3 graves now marked the spot where Robert's life had been anchored. And somewhere, the men who had done it, and the ones who had sent them, were still alive. Robert was not done with them. In the weeks after Florence's liberation, Robert moved like a man half in shadow. The grief was there, constant, sharp, but beneath it, something colder was forming. He could not bring Nina, Luce, and Cece back, but he could find out who had given the order to take them away. The first step was to speak even when it hurt. Allied officers returned more than once, sometimes with interpreters, sometimes alone. They asked him to tell the story again in detail, to recall the smallest things. A soldier's accent, the way they moved through the villa, the order in which names had been called. Robert answered each time, not because it was easy, but because repetition fixed the memory, made it harder for anyone to later say the details had faded. The Contadini offered what they could. Orlando remembered the captain's round spectacles, the calm way he spoke. Pip One described the soldiers' uniforms, fresh, as though newly issued, without the dirt and fray of men in long retreat. Others spoke of seeing the Germans in the area days before the killings, moving with purpose, asking questions. It wasn't enough to name them, but it was a start. Robert's days were divided between the necessary work of the estate and the slow, grinding work of remembrance. The orchards still needed tending. The wheat still had to be cut. War or no war, the land's clock didn't stop. But every visitor, every rumor, every whisper from Florence or the nearby villages, he gathered it all. Some told him to let it go. The war had taken thousands in Italy. Why chase 3 deaths when the world was trying to rebuild? But Robert couldn't think of it that way. To him, the killings weren't part of the anonymous tide of wartime loss. They were targeted. They had been meant as a message, and messages could be traced to the ones who sent them. By the autumn of 1944, Allied Command had recorded his statement and filed it among hundreds of others. To Robert, it felt like dropping a stone into deep water, the splash visible for a moment, then gone. He had no way of knowing that his search for answers would stretch across continents and decades, drawing in investigators, historians, prosecutors, and journalists. For now, he knew only this: he would not stop asking. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was grinding to its final months. Florence was free, much of northern Italy was still contested, and the Germans were retreating through the mountains. Then, in early May, the news broke: Germany had surrendered. The fighting was over. For most, the moment was a release, the lifting of a weight that had sat on their chests for years. Streets filled with music and voices. Churches rang their bells until the sound blurred into one long note of celebration. At Il Focardo, the sound of victory felt strangely muted. Robert walked the Cypress Drive alone, hearing the distant celebrations like they belonged to another world. The war might be finished, but his own battle was still only beginning. Post-war Italy was chaotic, a country trying to rebuild itself from rubble and mistrust. Former partisans, ex-fascists, Allied administrators, and a shaken civilian population all occupied the same narrow streets. Trials for collaborators were held in converted town halls and military barracks, but records were incomplete, witnesses scattered, and entire files lost in the confusion. Robert began visiting offices in Florence, talking to Allied officials and Italian police. He asked the same questions in every room. Had anyone identified the unit that entered Il Focardo on August 3, 1944? Had any officers matching the captain's description been captured? Was there a list of German soldiers known to have been in the area? The answers were vague at best. Some shrugged, some promised to look, others quietly advised him to move on. The men responsible were likely already dead or back in Germany. Robert refused to believe that. Letters became his next weapon. He wrote to contacts in Rome, to Allied headquarters, to anyone he thought might have access to records or prisoner lists. Weeks would pass with no reply. Then an envelope would arrive with little more than a polite refusal. But every rejection also gave him something to work with: a name, a date, a fragment of a report. He began to map them in a small ledger, drawing lines between names and places, building his own web of the war's aftermath. In quiet moments, he still walked the peach orchards and olive groves. The land had been their shared life, and tending it was both necessity and penance. But every time he looked at the villa, he saw the hallway where they had fallen. And every time he passed the gates, he imagined the day the soldiers had arrived, and how different it might have been if he had been there. The war had ended. His vendetta had not. By 1947, the war was history for most Italians. Reconstruction projects lined the roads, political posters competed for space on walls, and markets once empty now overflowed with goods. But for Robert, the war remained present. Not as a memory, but as an open wound. Every few months, a letter would arrive from some military office in Italy, Germany, or the Allied zones of occupation. Most contained nothing of value, but occasionally there was a glint, a mention of a unit in the Florence area that summer, or a captured officer whose description felt close to the one etched into Robert's mind. One report named the Hermann Göring Division as active near Rignano Salerno in early August 1944. That much he already knew. But another line caught his eye: a detachment under the command of an officer known for reprisal operations against civilians. The name was there, typed clean and without hesitation. It was the first concrete link between the faceless captain in his hall and a man who might still be alive. He began making inquiries about this officer, writing to offices in Rome, Munich, and even the new West German government's fledgling records bureau. Replies came slowly, if at all. Some were evasive. Others claimed the man had been killed in action before the war's end. Robert suspected these were lies, or at least convenient oversights. The post-war years were full of such shadows. Former Nazis and fascists moved quietly through Europe, some reinvented under false names, others shielded by allies who saw them as useful in the new struggle against communism. Justice was not the only priority in this new order. Meanwhile, life at Il Focardo went on in the most practical sense. Crops still needed harvesting, roofs still needed mending, taxes still needed paying. The contadini remained loyal, though the air around the villa carried the weight of what had happened there. The sound of children's laughter had not returned in the same way. Robert kept their rooms as they had been. Nina's sewing basket still sat in its corner. Luce's medical textbooks lined the shelf, pages marked with her neat handwriting. CCS dresses hung in the wardrobe, the faint scent of lavender sachets clinging to them. They were reminders, yes, but also anchors, proof that they had lived, and that their story would not be reduced to a line in a military archive. By 1949, Robert had a small folder of names, dates, and unit records. It was enough to know there were men still out there who had stood in his hall, who had pulled the triggers. But the walls around that truth were high, and he was climbing them alone. He didn't yet know that it would take decades, and the persistence of others who would take up his cause, to reach the top. By the early 1950s, the maps had been redrawn again, not just in Europe's borders, but in its loyalties. The Cold War was hardening, and in the eyes of many governments, yesterday's enemies were becoming today's strategic assets. For Robert, this shift was poison to his search. The Allies had once pledged to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, but now, prosecutions slowed to a trickle. Files were quietly shelved, suspects released, and entire units reabsorbed into the military forces of the new West German state. The political priority was stability, not reckoning. When Robert wrote to military authorities in Bonn, the answers grew more evasive. Some claimed they had no record of the men he named. Others insisted the unit's activities in Tuscany were unconfirmed, despite eyewitness accounts and Allied wartime intelligence. In Florence, the war's scars were slowly vanishing under new stone and plaster. Cafes were full again, and the black market stalls had been replaced by legitimate trade. For many, the violence of 1944 was a chapter already closed. But at Il Focardo, the past was never silent. Robert's home remained both sanctuary and reminder. The orchard still bloomed in spring, but its beauty came threaded with absence. Every harvest brought back the memory of Nina's laughter, Luce's chatter about her medical studies, CCS quiet sketches of the fields. Some evenings, Robert would walk the Cypress Drive alone, the same route the soldiers had taken, as if retracing it could somehow erase their footprints. Occasionally, journalists would appear, some local, others foreign, having heard whispers about the Einstein murders. They came with notebooks and cameras, eager for a connection to the famous physicist in America. Robert spoke to them, but always steered the story away from fame and toward truth. His family were not symbols, they were people. And people had names, histories, and the right to justice. A few articles made it into print. They brought sympathy but no new leads. The men who had ordered and carried out the killings were still invisible. As the decade wore on, Robert's correspondence with officials became less frequent, not because he had given up, but because he had learned how little they would give him. His folder of documents grew slowly, each new page a reminder of how far the truth still lay. What he didn't know was that his fight would not end with him, and that others, decades later, would reopen the case with tools and access he could only dream of. By the 1960s, Robert Einstein was an old man in years but not in spirit. His frame had thinned, his hair had gone white, but his eyes still carried the same stubborn resolve that had kept him searching through the rubble of post-war Europe. The world around him had shifted again. Italy was in the midst of its economic miracle, a rising tide of industry and modernity sweeping away much of the visible damage of the war. Young people in Florence talked of cinema, fashion, and politics. Their lives were forward-facing, not backward-looking. But for Robert, the past was not something to be moved past. It lived in the walls of Il Focardo, in the faded photographs on the mantel, in the unopened letters he kept in a small wooden box. Over the years, he had made occasional trips to Germany, chasing leads that rarely panned out. Once, in Munich, he thought he had located a man from the detachment that came to his villa. But the name led to a different person entirely, a dead end in a city that seemed to have perfected the art of misdirection. He came to understand that finding justice in peacetime could be harder than in war. War was brutal, yes, but it was honest in its chaos. Peacetime could bury the truth under layers of bureaucracy, treaties, and polite denials. At Il Focardo, Robert kept his family's memory alive in the only way he knew, by refusing to let them be reduced to footnotes. Friends and occasional visitors heard their names spoken often. He would talk about Luce's stubborn intelligence, CC's quiet talent for drawing, Nina's fierce wit. He wanted the world to remember them as they had been, full of life, not frozen in the moment of their deaths. But the war years had taken their toll. Robert's health began to fail. Arthritis made the orchard work harder. His eyes tired more quickly over his ledgers. And still, the file of names and documents remained on his desk, the one task he could not set aside. By the time the 1970s arrived, Robert was aware that he might never see the men responsible brought to trial. Yet even that thought did not break his resolve. If he could not finish the work, perhaps someone else would. Someone with the will and the tools to see it through. In his mind, it was never a matter of if, only when. Robert Einstein died in 1970, in the same Tuscan countryside that had been both his refuge and his torment. The orchard trees he had planted decades earlier still stood, their roots deep in the same soil that held the graves of Nina, Luce, and Cici. Those who knew him in his later years spoke of two sides to the man. There was Robert the neighbor, generous, quietly humorous, fond of the land and its rhythms. And there was Robert the survivor, marked by loss, carrying a private ledger of wrongs that could never be balanced in his lifetime. He left behind not just the villa and the orchards, but the file he had built over 25 years. Names, dates, scraps of testimony, official replies, and unanswered questions. It was not a complete case file, but it was a map, one that pointed toward truths yet to be fully uncovered. For decades after his death, the murders at Il Focardo lay dormant in public memory. Italy moved on. The Cold War shifted priorities. Younger generations barely knew the story at all. But history has a way of resurfacing, especially when the right person comes looking. In the 1990s and early 2000s, historians and investigative journalists began revisiting unsolved wartime crimes. Archives that had once been sealed in Germany, Italy, and Allied repositories began to open under new transparency laws. The name Robert Einstein appeared in more than one forgotten file. Documents confirmed what Robert had long believed. The killings were not random. They were an act of calculated reprisal, carried out by German soldiers acting under orders, intended as a message because of Robert's connection to Albert Einstein. The reopening of the case did not bring swift justice. Many of the men named in the late investigations were already dead, their graves unmarked or hidden. Others had lived quiet post-war lives, their wartime service either buried in official silence or excused as following orders. But the renewed attention did something Robert might have valued even more than a trial. It made the truth visible, put names in print. It placed the murders of Nina, Luce, and Cici in the historical record where they could not be erased. Today, Illinois Focardo still stands. The Cypress Drive is as long and quiet as it was on that summer morning in 1944. The orchard blooms each spring, and somewhere in the stillness of the Tuscan hills, the echo of Robert's vow remains, a promise that memory can be as enduring as justice, and sometimes just as necessary.